Welcome to Slavery, Class, and Pre-Civil War Tensions. This is Melinda Klein. Rapid economic and political change underway in America after 1820 prompted many men and women to question their values. As social problems increased with industrialization and the market revolution, Americans attempted to correct the problems within reformed societies. Responding to the demand for cotton, Southern planters extended slavery into the Old Southwest. This expansion led to a sectional confrontation over slavery that the Missouri Compromise did not resolve. Enslaved blacks adopted English and some white religious practices, along with free blacks in northern cities, forged a distinct African American culture. Transporting slaves and the increased numbers of runaways prompted a new American literary genre, the slave narrative. These texts fueled the abolitionist fires in bringing down slavery as an institution. Lincoln, in his own personal views, believed that slavery would lose its momentum in the industrial age and end on its own without any significant attempt by northern religious groups or through conflict. However, with his election in 1860, Abraham Lincoln entered office knowing war was inevitable. No one seriously doubts that the enormous economic stake the South had in its slave labor force was a major factor in the sectional disputes that erupted in the middle of the 19th century. As you can see by these figures here, all of the slaves in the United States from 1805 to 1860 are depicted. 1805, there was just about 1 million slaves worth $300 million. 55 years later, there were 4 million slaves worth close to $3 billion. While reasonable solutions to ending slavery were discussed in Congress, it is estimated that the cost of having the government buy all the slaves in the United States in 1860, around $2.7 billion, was out of the question. This was a very large sum and could not be paid all at once. Even if payments were spread out over 25 years, the annual costs of such a scheme would involve a tripling of the federal government. This scheme then was abandoned. Slavery in the South reinforced class distinction as well as economic purposes. While most white Southerners owned less than 10 slaves, about 70% of the Southern slave owners, the elite held large plantations, dominated locale and state politics, some 10,000 families out of 270,000. 3,000 families out of 10,000 owned more than 100 slaves. The plantation was a system of obligation. The father was the patriarch, a benevolent caretaker of servants, slaves, wife, and children. He was expected to provide all for their needs: clothing, food, housing, medical care, and oversee religion. In the 1840s and the 1850s, male and female abolitionists eagerly sought out and published book-length accounts of slavery written by runaway slaves themselves. These chilling stories of captivity and successful escapes in the voices of former slaves had enormous emotional power and were instrumental in the effort of abolitionists to influence public opinion and end slavery. The slave narratives were derived from the following pattern discussed here. The African American slave narratives followed a three-stage pattern in their stories, beginning either with an idyllic childhood in West Africa or the relative innocence of childhood on a southern plantation. The bulk of the story discussed next was aimed at northern readers, describing in vivid details the brutal oppressions of captivity and slavery dwelling on the horrors of slave ships, slave sales, and the breakup of family, the daily beatings, punishment, and hard rigors of life on the plantation. Slave narratives would wind up their stories with a heroic will to survive, getting new jobs, learning how to read and write, connecting with loved ones, and finding Christianity. Dred Scott v. Sanford, 1857, was a lawsuit decided by the U.S. Supreme Court that ruled people of African descent, whether or not they were slaves, could never be citizens of the United States, and that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in federal territories. This was only the second time that the Supreme Court had found an act of Congress to be unconstitutional, specifically to this case, the Compromise of 1850. After the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 was passed by Congress, this stirred Harriet Beecher Stowe to become an abolitionist. Harriet Beecher Stowe in 1852 had published her collection of stories which became Uncle Tom's Cabin. This book was an immediate success. Within a week of its printing, it sold 10,000 copies. Just 2 years later, in 1854, it had been translated into 20 different languages. In 1862, when President Lincoln didn't fulfill his promise and sign the Emancipation Proclamation, Harriet Beecher Stowe decided she would talk to him herself. She gathered up her children and went to Washington, D.C. Because there is no written documentation of this conference, no one knows exactly how she did it, but she persuaded him to sign. However, one thing comes down to us. We know that when Abraham Lincoln met with Stowe, he reportedly greeted her with, quote, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war," end of quote. Civil rights and voting rights for blacks were not major issues before the Civil War. They became important during Reconstruction. The issue of maltreatment of slaves was promoted by abolitionists and fueled by literary texts like Uncle Tom's Cabin, but was not one of the main reasons why the South left the Union. Slavery was at the root of economic, moral, and political differences that led to control issues, states' rights, and secession of Southern states. Southern politicians saw the election of Lincoln as an act of war. South Carolina led the South in seceding first. That is, secession, leaving the Union, triggered the war. Congress in July 1862 moved to free the slaves by passing the Second Confiscation Act. The goal was to weaken the rebellion, which was led and controlled by slave owners. This did not abolish legally slavery. The 13th Amendment would do this later. But it showed that Lincoln had the support of Congress in liberating the slaves owned by the rebels. Lincoln's views of the role of the federal government on the subject of slavery are more complicated. He maintained that the federal government could not constitutionally bar slavery in states where it already existed. It is important to remember that Lincoln, from the beginning of the war, made it clear that the North was fighting the war to preserve the Union. By 1863, black regiments had been formed, and over the course of the war, 186,000 black soldiers served in the military, turning the course of the war in favor of the Union.